and gentlemen, we welcome you all after a long interval of 18 months. We're elated to host a physical session of Kitab, an initiative by Prabha Khaitan Foundation, established by Dr. Prabha Khaitan in the 1980s. The foundation provides a platform to caregivers, committed individuals, like-minded institutions to implement cultural, educational, literary, and social welfare projects in India. During the dark days of the pandemic, the foundation continued with their sessions through virtual platforms to uplift the spirit of its patrons. As life gradually is coming back to normalcy, the foundation has begun to host physical sessions in some cities adhering to all COVID protocols and taking all necessary precautions. A birth of a book always calls for a celebration. Kitab provides a platform to authors to display and showcase their newest literary works before a discerning audience and media through tastefully curated launches. Today, we are honored to launch Dr. Vikram Sampath's new book, Savarkar, A Contested Legacy. Here, I would also like to thank the ITC Grand Central, which has been associated with the Prabha Khaitan Foundation for a very long time. Without much ado, now I request Ms. Swati Agarwal of the Ehsaas Women of Mumbai to introduce our esteemed guests.
History is tedious. Hindutva is polemical. That might be the usual reaction, but not when it comes from the pen of an unusual and sagacious scholar like Vikram Sampath, who has given us sumptuous slices of Indian historiography, whether it was the splendor of royal Mysore or the melodious biography of Gauhar Jan. Vikramji's Veer Savarkar volumes have deftly navigated controversies, skipped overcautious bookstores, sidestepped unwilling reviewers, and have become national bestsellers, thanks to the changing mindsets of digital New India. We agree with you, Vikramji, that there is not and cannot be just one hallowed, sacrosanct image of India. We all carry our own image of India in our hearts and our souls. So as you say, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let multiple opinions be an accepted norm. We are grateful to you for deciphering forgotten history, wading through contested legacy, and unveiling the persona of Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. A legend who might evoke divisive reactions and earn some not-so-salubrious monikers, but is an undeniable part of the Indian heritage. He was awarded Sahitya Akademi's first Yuva Puraskar in English literature in 2012 and the ARSC International Award for Excellence in Historical Research in New York for his book on Gauhar Jan. In 2015, Vikramji was among the 4 writers and artists to be selected as a writer in residence at the Rashtrapati Bhavan. A trained Carnatic vocalist, Vikramji has established the Archive of Indian Music, India's first digital sound repository for vintage recording. Today, we have gathered here to celebrate the launch of Dr. Vikram Sampath's new book, Savarkar, A Contested Legacy. In conversation with him is Mr. Yogesh Pamar. Yogeshji is a journalist for 26 years, holding a postgraduate from Tata Institute of Social Science. He has worked with the Indian Express, Elle, NDTV, DNA, Rediff, while he has eclectically reported on everything from politics, crime, entertainment, sports, environment. His forte is reporting on hunger, poverty, destitution, exclusion, discrimination, caste, gender, sexuality, performing arts, and cinema. With immense pleasure, I announce that today we have with us the dynamic, the vibrant, the architect of change, Ms. Priyanka Chaturvedi, Member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha from Maharashtra, and Deputy Leader of Shiv Sena. We are fortunate to have a brilliant think tank like you, ma'am, who makes astute political decision, works for the downtrodden, and will make women's rights a reality. You are a trailblazer, a heterodox, and a champion of social causes who wakes us up from our social torpor and urges us to carve a new tomorrow, a new definition of womanhood, and a new India. Mrs. Chaturvedi is an avid reader and blogger and is a trustee of Prayas Charitable Trust, which runs 2 schools to provide education to over 200 underprivileged children. In 2010, she was selected as a participant in ISB's 10,000 Women Entrepreneurs Certificate Program, a global initiative by the Goldman Sachs Foundation for Women Entrepreneurs. I'm running out of breath as well as words to describe your momentous accomplishments. I will settle for simply saying I'm proud to welcome you, Ms. Chaturvedi, and hope that some of your luster today rubs on to all of us. I now request Anvi Thakkar to please come and take this forward.
Mr. Vikram Sampath ji, Mr. Yogesh Pawar ji, Mr. Ranjit Savarkar ji to join us on the dais. I would also request Mr. Balani, our General Manager, ITC, West ITC Hotel, to felicitate our delegates with Utturois. Now the time has come for which we all have been waiting for Mr. Balani, our General Manager, ITC Grand Central, kindly join the delegates to unveil Dr. Vikram Sampath's Savarkar Legacy, Contested Legacy. Thank you, everyone. Now I would like to request everyone to take their seats, relax, and enjoy today's conversation with Dr. Vikram Sampath and Mr. Pawar.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We live in a very strange time when polarization is everything. Whether you like something or don't like something, suddenly the world doesn't seem to want to think of anything in between. You can either pedestalize someone to go beyond the point of scrutiny or ask any questions of, or otherwise you revile them to an extent where nobody wants to have any dialogue or don't allow that side to even speak up. So we live in those kind of times, and it is increasingly becoming difficult for people to have a dialogue and sit across each other and talk about things which they don't agree on. So it's very nice to see that today we have people from 3 different spectrums, in a sense, come together to talk about a book. So to begin with, maybe I should start with a question about, the book. When I opened it and, we unraveled it, you must have seen that it's quite the book. So I was telling Vikram on the phone, Vikram begins his book, Suitable Boy, by warning the reader, saying that the book may strain his purse and sprain his wrist. So, were you ever worried about the fact that in this time and day, when people have such short attention spans to come to a tome like this, was that ever a worry?
First of all, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here to share my joy on this very, very significant occasion. It seems like the culmination of a long journey, which took almost 5 years to put together these 2 volumes about this person, a complex person with so many shades, with so many dimensions, and so difficult to understand, but who's so relevant in today's political discourse and public life. And I'm thankful to all of you. It's so nice to be back, as I was telling Priyanka ji, that it's so nice finally be back to physical events of some kind after being in the online Zoom space for the last 18 months. And I hope our country moves and the world moves into better health and better times. Yeah, your question is very relevant. I don't know what to say because I initially had a plan to bring it out in 3 volumes, not just 2. And it was left to my publishers, Penguin, to tell me very subtly that, hey, this is not one of Amish's trilogy or Ashwin Sanghi's thrillers, which is going to, run into so many volumes. And I really didn't know that the book would actually touch a chord with people. As I think Swatiji mentioned very subtly, the first volume, many bookstores actually refused to even stock the book. I've been in the literary field for about 13, 14 years. They said, we have nothing against the author. We'll keep his other books, say on Gauhar Jan or Mysore and so on. But Savarkar we will not keep in our bookstore. Mainstream media curiously ignored the book and continue to, in fact. There is very little engagement with the book, particularly print media. I think electronic media still wants some masala every night to have raucous debates on. But print media, curiously, even to pan the book, they did not do that. And so, but for social media and the democratization of thought today, where everyone who has a smartphone and an opinion can put it out online, it's only through that word of mouth that the book went on to become a national bestseller. The first volume went into multiple reprints. It's being translated into Marathi, which has just come out, and also the Hindi edition as well. And the Marathi volume has been translated by none other than Mr. Ranjit Savarkar ji along with Manjari Marathe ji. So I think there was a hunger for this man because his story was purposely hidden from discourse. He was a persona non grata in Indian public life. Anybody who was even associated with him through a distance had to pay a very, very heavy price for it. I've mentioned very often this one anecdote of how someone of the reputation of Pandit Hridaynath Mangeshkar ji actually lost his job in the All India Radio here in Bombay only for the crime of tuning Savarkar's poems, Sagara Pran Talmalala, the famous poem that he had written. And apparently he got a show cause notice for that, asking to explain about why he chose this. And he's gone on record to say he gave a 2-line reply saying, good poem and a great poet. Isn't that reason enough to tune it? But then he lost his job for that. So that was the amount of calumny and the amount of pushing the person away. And the more you push something under the carpet, I think it has a tendency to resurface. And we're seeing just that, where despite its thickness, I was quite pleasantly surprised that people, including young people, are reading it. I was so pleasantly surprised a few days ago, where a 12-year-old boy, Shashwat Pandey, on Twitter, he had actually posted his picture with both the books, and he joined an online event, and he's read the book cover to cover, and he was asking me questions. A 12-year-old boy. I was not so, nerdy enough to read so much at the age of 12, and that to history. But that's the beauty of today's India. I think people are consuming literature if presented well.
Actually, Vikram, you've almost led me on to the next question that I had in mind about this whole socio-political apartheid, of sorts, where people say that one school of thought is just not welcome. I want to come to that question and also join Priyanka ji's views on that, because she's going to incidentally give us a very different worldview here, because she's now belonged to another organization and is now in an organization which the founder of whom shares that same title that Savarkar does. So in that sense, it will be very interesting to get her perspective. But before that, I want to ask you that when you took on this sort of humongous task, I believe that you said somewhere in the prologue that at one point in time you told your mom that I want to give it up, and you want to stop doing this because you felt it's beyond you. Yeah. Why was that, and what was it? Just the amount of work that was involved, or were there other obstacles?
Both. I think, my mother was always very scared of the kind of projects I would take up. I'd written something about Tipu Sultan in one of the newspapers. It was not, I'm planning his biography next, I don't know what's going to happen. But then just an article I wrote about Tipu Sultan, and my effigy was burnt in Bangalore, in the heart of the city, in front of a newspaper building, asking for my apology for it, which I said over my dead body, I'm not giving it because I've based it on facts. And she was really so scared and said, why are you a sucker for punishment? Why can't you take, simple, easy characters of the past? Gohar Jan was still safe to deal with. And she was also kind of saying, are you really sure? Do you really want this controversy? Why can't you lead a peaceful life? And while, the other characters, it was very difficult to get material. In Savarkar's case, it was, I think, a problem of plenty. There was just so much of material. Just one trip to the British Library in London and the National Archives of UK, and I managed to get about 25,000 pages of material, hitherto unaccessed by historians. And I was a senior fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in Delhi, and there the entire Savarkar private papers in 26 microfilms, because he was under surveillance both by the British government as well as independent India's first government. And so every letter, every piece of paper that went in and out of his house, that was tracked. And these are all there in Delhi. Again, I see the accession register hardly accessed by anybody. So, that's when there was so much material, and how to plod through this, how to make sense of this man who meant so many things at the same time, a multifaceted genius. That was what caused me to be very diffident. And I remember my mother telling me that incident, which I quote in the book as well, that she said she was not a mountain climber, but still I don't know how she came up with that anecdote, that when you're trekking Mount Everest, you should never look at the peak, nor should you look backwards to see how much you have traversed or how much is left to traverse. You just take one step at a time, and before you realize, you'll be at the summit. And that's exactly what I followed. Of course, she was to be my research assistant in my journey. I lost her midway because she, being a Maharashtrian herself, she would have helped me a lot with the translations of a lot of his work. But then, that was the whole problem of bringing this man to life in a way that is not either of the extremes. I think that's the problem with Savarkar's, historiography. Either he's eulogized to the skies, or he's demonized as someone who has no trait of good in him. So to go that middle path and be objective, that was also very difficult.
Actually, this is exactly what I was trying to say was, your position that you take on somebody or a school of thought doesn't necessarily have to be carved in stone and up there. It can be dynamic. And who better to talk about this dynamism than Priyanka Chaturvedi, because maybe you want to tell us, because coming from a party where you wanted, Mani Shankarji wanted a plaque removed just then when he was at Port Blair, to now being with the Shiv Sena, which culturally finds for Savarkar more acceptable than maybe politically so now. Because in this government, it can be a bit tricky to take positions one way or the other. Maybe you want to talk about Savarkar's
yes, I think I'm in a very unique position where I can talk about my past, I can talk about my present, and perhaps look into my future.
Where you sit in the middle for a reason.
Yes, exactly, a centrist. I must say one thing about Mani Shankar Iyer. I never agreed with him even when I was in the Congress. So I totally disagree with that part of what you mentioned. And I have always, as a student of history, even before I changed my political party and the platform that I am a part of, I've always said one thing, because my role has been that of a spokesperson. And I have always said to many people who I have met in person, to students I have engaged with, to the youngsters I have engaged with, that you can only understand the context of history when you've read all sides. And then you can make up your mind on the side that you wish to be seen in, pursue. You may disagree, but you cannot diminish anyone's role in history. You may have a differing point of view, but that difference cannot lead to total unacceptability of a person. Today I was asking my 14-year-old girl, my daughter, that do you know who Veer Savarkarji was? And she said, no, he's not in my history textbook. He was not in my history textbook either. So even if I wanted to know another context, I did not know of it. I only knew of history books that are written. And I must say, Vikram, and I must compliment you for it, that a historian's job is to not just chronicle history, but is also to be objective, which you just mentioned. It is not to write history from your judgmental biases. And that is why this book has a lot of relevance. I remember when I tweeted that I'll be a chief guest or so-called participant in this book launch. He was trolled, I was trolled, and all my old tweets, which I haven't deleted, came popping out to tell him that, listen, how could you do this? How could you invite her for something like this? And to all those people, I'd just like to say, maybe because I hadn't got such an extensive scholarly work that Dr. Vikram Sampath has managed to do through his 2 volumes about Veer Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. And that is perhaps the reason why, like you said, it has to be dynamic. You change your perspective. You rethink your ideas. You rethink your beliefs when you read some more. And that is where I come from, and that is where I stand today. And a lot of it has to do with what you've done, so might as well get trolled for it. So I think it is not just when I was reading this book, and I've read the book, Vikram. I've read the book, and I must say, he hasn't made a case for him. He hasn't said that, listen, whatever you've read about him is incorrect. He hasn't tried to hide or whitewash some parts of history. He's put it as it is. And that is extremely important for the youth of today. The reason why this book is a bestseller, and I must share this before I end my answer to this. The reason why this book is a bookseller is because when you deny people knowledge of something important, and so, where you're demonizing somebody and everybody wants to know why is he being put through this trial. Let's hear what he has to say, and you don't get that. And when you get that, the floodgates of history reopen and there is a debate, discussion once again. And that is why I believe, let the discussions flow. Let the debates and let the ideas be debated and discussed and dissented, which this book will show you. Immensely discussed, immensely debated, but no disrespect for individuals. There was disagreement on ideas. So when a Mahatma Gandhi visited Veer Savarkar ji, met his wife, and he went along with his wife at his home, he said this, let's disagree. And that's what even Veer Savarkar ji said, let's disagree on ideas. But we don't hate each other for who we are because we're fighting for one common goal, and that is the future of the nation and how we see it. So that is where I'll end it.
Just to add to what she said, very interestingly, when Savarkarji came out of captivity in Ratnagiri, and he had all these public receptions in Mumbai and other cities, the kind of language that his political opponents, including from the left, Shripad Dange or M.N. Roy, and of course from the Congress, Subhash Chandra Bose, even Jawaharlal Nehru at that time, this is 1937, there is so much of warmth for him, there is so much of respect. There is, someone like an M.N. Roy or Dange says, I don't agree with your ideology. I think the Hindutva and other things that you espouse is not something I agree with, but I have immense respect for your sacrifice. See, Rajagopalachari writes a biography on Savarkar, and Rajagopalachari is the right-hand man of Mahatma Gandhi. So, unlike today where political opponents are almost like enemies at each other's throat, luckily not one myself, and I pity my dear friend for being in the, right in the crossfire. I think that's also something we can learn from our history, saying we can be ideological opponents, but within certain amount of civility, even to opposing views.
And I, just to take this forward, I just say one thing. Disagreement in a democracy does not mean that you do not accept someone's idea. You may have an opposing point of view with that idea. But what really emerges out of such disagreement is a decisive way forward. Unfortunately, when two, I would say, people take totally ideologically opposite stance, which is very different from our civilizational history. India, if you look at its civilization, has had a very centrist point of view. When you take ideologically opposite views and you don't find a center point, that's when you start losing value of democracy as we know it. And that is why you cannot have extreme stances. You need to be able to disagree, disengage also at times, but find a decisive way forward. And that's the only way I think India can learn from this book and the engagements he's had with various political representatives, including Muhammad Ali Jinnah and his point of view, including Dr. B.R. Sahib Ambedkar, and including many, many such people. That is why perhaps in 1980s, I think 1980, when Indira Gandhi ji was the Prime Minister then, acknowledged his contribution, called him a freedom fighter, called him, I mean, she used some really good words for him, because they understand his role in India's independent history, pre-independent history, I'd say.
Actually, I'm glad both of you raised this point, because we've lived in a time when we look at history, people would be at completely, antipodal ends of the political debate, and yet they would not sort of hate each other like that. So Tilak, who had such strong anti-Dalit views, or he was, for example, at the forefront of fighting the people who were trying to fight the plague and pandemic in that era. But if you notice, when he died, one of the pallbearers was somebody like Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and somebody from the Muslim League. All three of them were there as his pallbearers when the body was taken from Girgaon to Girgaon Chowpatty. So I'm just saying that we are talking of a time when people really knew how to look out for each other and speak to each other irrespective of where they came from. But today we don't see that happening a lot. Today, once it's like my way or the highway. So it is like, if one party comes into power, they shut down everyone else and they don't let them speak. And is this something that is now here for good? And in that sense, is Savarkar, we've called him a poster boy for a lot of things, but we very often don't call him a poster boy for the intolerance of the left. So while you have the rabid right, you've always had the lunatic left on the other side. So both of you, I'd like both of you to react to this and tell me what you think of this. Do you feel there is room that we can, or things have gone beyond recall to a point where people cannot talk to each other? Or do you feel now there is still scope for people to talk to each other and we can go back to that political space where there can be dialogue and we can accept icons like these also? Yes?
You'd want to go first? No. I would say, yes, we are living through those times in history where we seem to have forgotten what disagreement is, what debates are, what decisive leadership is. And it is a long way away from, re-establishing those ideas. What I'd want to say is it shows greatness of human minds. This particular book, or if I look at Jawaharlal Nehru's book or any other book, it shows about greatness of individuals who are fighting for a larger cause. And that is why they are able to find those sources of disagreement. Now, in terms of rabid right and lunatic left, yes, I'm totally in agreement with this. There have been some people who've become gatekeepers of liberal values, secular values, and they believe that what they say is the only way to be accepted with the halo of being a liberal voice or a secular voice. Their ideas have been imposed upon lots and lots of people in the society, and that is why perhaps you see not much discussion in your first volume happening in bookstores, etc. Because it has been on the minds of people for years to come that if I speak on something, I may become unacceptable. I remember, and I must say, make this about my personal trajectory as a political person. I come from a non-political background. I continue believing in the secular values of the nation and how we see the future of the nation as, and there can be no, I would say, sympathy for one side and absolute disregard for the other. If we mean secular, we treat citizens as equals, and we have to strive for it. That is my belief. And when I moved from the Congress party to the Shiv Sena, I had the same liberal, secular people trying to totally mock me, mock my decision, mock my whatever I was tweeting, decide that, oh God, Priyanka Chaturvedi is no longer a liberal person, she's no longer an ex-person. So that is something I said even then. I will refuse to cow down to those who hold this self-certified gatekeeping job of secularism and liberalism. Wherever I will work for the causes I strongly believe in. And that is what I continue to do, and perhaps that is what it should be about. Those who become gatekeepers suddenly also become rule makers. And that is something our country cannot go down that path, and it has to continuously challenge. And that is why perhaps social media has become a more democratic space to be able to put a point of view, which may be liberal in thought, because if you're defending freedom of speech, then how can you not discuss and engage on Veer Savarkar? If you're talking about freedom of speech, why can't you disagree or perhaps someone agree with what his point of view is? Could be very, I would say, revolutionary in thought, could be very rebellious in thought. But despite it, a country's foundation can only grow stronger when you do not hide its blacks, whites, and grays, and you do not make it about black and white. So no human is perfect. They were all humans working in an imperfect space for perfect ideals, for a nation which will have imperfections, but for a nation which will stand on its own abilities and on its own belief and on the values it has inculcated over its civilizational history.
You mentioned the word poster boy, and I've often wondered, Savarkar should actually be the poster boy of the so-called liberals in India, because he was a liberal at heart. To be a little provocative, I would say Gandhi was rather dictatorial when it came to, his decisions within the Congress. It was either my way or the highway. If you don't agree with me, I'm going to go on a hunger strike. That's not the way you engage, and you're forcing moral coercion, many other things. But then, as an objective, non-political person, I'm talking, on the contrary, Savarkar was someone who always welcomed people who held a different viewpoint, including he would keep the press cuttings of people who were opposed to him, to engage with people who did not agree with him. And that was also one of the reasons for the nemesis of the Hindu Mahasabha, which had so many dissensions within the Savarkar faction, the Shyama Prasad Mukherjee faction, the North Indian caucus of Raja Maheshwar Dayal Seth and Jugal Kishore Birla, and all of this that was going on. It was not a dictatorial kind of, my stamp over the rest of everyone. And Priyanka spoke about secularism, and that was, if someone actually stood for secular values, in the true sense of the word, not in the perverse way it has, it's made its way in our national discourse, the Constitution of Free Hindustan State that the Hindu Mahasabha came up with, a document in 1945, 5 years before the actual Constitution of India was drafted, and having a lot of similarities to the final draft of the Indian Constitution. And Savarkar's own speeches as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha said, the minorities need not even have a ghost of suspicion in their minds that in the Hindu Rashtra that he conceived of, any legitimate political, cultural, linguistic, religious rights of any group of people is going to be trampled upon by the state. If that is done, then the state would endeavor to remove those, infringements. The majority is not going to get any extra privileges only because they are more in number, and vice versa, the minorities are not going to get any concessions only because they are less in number. In the eyes of the law, everybody is equal. What faith you follow is your private business in the confines of your house. But in the eyes of the law, you're all the same. And minority institutions also can be supported by the government, like madrasas and churches. But the amount of money you give to them is going to be proportional to the amount of taxes you pay to the national exchequer. So if you're useful to the country, you get something back. If you're a liability, you're not going to be. But the fundamental cornerstone was also allegiance to the nation. And that was also in the context of the time where we had the pernicious movements like the Khilafat agitation and so on, where we were mobilizing people of this country on extraterritorial, faith-based extraterritorial movements. And so pinning that, your nationality back to this country and pinning your interests also back to this country was very important. And as long as you did that, then everybody was equal. In fact, in that constitution, it says, there's not going to be any state religion of the free Hindustan state or in any of its provinces. And in schools, there's not going to be any religious training that is going to be imparted. So what else is secularism? And still, and this coming from the so-called, the most ultra-right party of the time, the Hindu Mahasabha, was also talking about a truly secular nation. But then we need to see why then, despite that, today, Savarkar's name is always that he was a communal bigot and all of that, which is very, sad.
So from what you just told us, it seems like he was an equal opportunity offender in the sense his views on beef, his views on the minorities, all these views that you see, may not find so much favor with the current regime in power. So you find so much of what he says in contrary to what we are seeing happening right now in the country, whether it is the lynchings, whether it is the targeting of minorities and all that. So in that sense, how far are we from what Savarkar envisaged for us to be where we should be? How far have we gone from there? What would you say about that?
Why are you drawing me into political conflict? I don't want to get into. I'm someone who looks back into history. She'll be, best placed to talk about how far we are in terms of contemporary politics. But there too, I think it's a very unilateral view we take. Even about lynchings or whatever that we talk of. I think we do. There are equal number of cow vigilantes also who get lynched. And it's an animal that is very useful in the rural economy, as he always postulated. So in rural India, if someone kidnaps someone's kid or even your pet or whatever, there would be an outbreak of violence. I'm not condoning that at all. It's a law and order issue. But then these things have been happening on a regular basis. I don't know how much of it is religion based or whatever, or someone is sitting in some room and actually devising that chalo aaj we'll do lynchings of people in en masse. I don't know if that's happening. But then his views again, while he said the cow is a useful animal, he does not probably think of it personally as something that is worship worthy. Though he said if you want to worship it, you worship it in your house. Don't bring it again into public policy. Even Krishna was Gopal.
I believe he wanted people to worship Narasimha, not the cow.
You need to be.
Yes, Priyanka ji, if you want to tell us, what do you think of this?
So I do strongly disagree with the lynching bit that he has spoken about, because I always believe that it's about inequalities that manifest itself through the violence that we see. While law and order is definitely an issue, but it is, I would say, where Savarkarji was right was when he said that everyone has to be treated as equal citizens under one flag. Equal citizens, equal contribution, equal rights. That is something that he spoke of. And there should be and we were living through times when he came up with something like this, through times when we were seeing, every time we pin the blame on him for caste divide, religious divide, and all the work, anything that is not easy to answer, it's because of him, by one section. The other section also goes towards Nehru now. We witnessed that too in history. But however, caste divisions, religious divisions are time immemorial in this country. And till we do not address this as a truly equal nation, which is equal for all, which were perhaps one of the points that Savarkarji spoke about when the Hindu Mahasabha came up with its constitutional points, that what should be part of India's constitution post-independence. Till then, I think we'll continue to fail all our leaders, stalwarts in the freedom movement. We believed that after 1857, the entire movement began. That movement gained credibility until the time we got its independence. And the ideal move forward would have been eradicating caste equations, which he worked towards tremendously in Ratnagiri. When I moved from a national party and I came back to Maharashtra to work, though I'm a girl born in Mumbai, lived in Mumbai, but I did not really understand the relevance from a political perspective of how important Veer Savarkarji was for the people of Maharashtra. Only when I started reading. Like I said, you learn only when you read, when you're open to knowledge. Otherwise, when Tagore envisaged a country where mind was without fear, he said, let our world not be divided into narrow walls. So what we have actually created are narrow walls deciding what the idea of this nation should be. So a casteless society, a society which does not look at a person's religion but looks at everyone as equal citizens under the national flag, is what our aspiration should be. Could have been very diverse ways of reaching this, what Mahatma Gandhiji's way was, what Savarkarji's way was, but that is what we have to achieve, but where we are consistently continuing to fail. I'll be very honest.
Vikram, at the end of your prologue, you also say, like, this is not sort of a blanket thing to say that, okay, I support everything that Savarkarji said. I am not here to someone who's going to, for people to have used this book to sort of go and defend Savarkar in any possible way. There are lots of things which I am myself not very happy to support. That's how. So can you tell us, when you had that kind of a worldview and then you approached this book, how open were people from his family and the trust? How open were they? Did they know that this was going to be your stand, and how did they react? So can you tell us a little about that? And what are some of these particularly contentious things that you felt you were unhappy to support?
Okay, again, you're putting me in a spot with every question, and I'm like one landmine after the other. No, I mean, I must give complete credit to Mr. Ranjit Savarkar here, that not once, I mean, the manuscript of both the books was something I shared with him before it went to print. Barring, some factual errors here and there or something that I had missed, he never dictated the narrative to me that this is how it has to be, or even those aspects of his life that I was a little critical of. I mentioned, I mean, his, lack of hold over the party, which I just mentioned. Maybe, not the mass leader that probably what Gandhi was, which he probably could not, because he was way ahead of his times, that he could not convince so many people to become his followers. And so many of these aspects of his life. And I've also mentioned that, at a critical time when partition was staring us in our face, though the Hindu Mahasabha and Savarkar tried to unite the non-Muslim League Muslim parties in coalitions, whether it was in Bengal with the Krishak Praja Party, or in the Unionist Party and Ittihad Party in Sindh and all of that. Despite that, this monolith that the Muslim League became as the only voice of the Muslim, political opinion, which it was not. In fact, those provinces which formed Pakistan eventually were not even supporters of the Muslim League initially, electorally at least. The idea of Pakistan was sown in the United Provinces, what is Uttar Pradesh today, and in the, the madrasas there, where this whole idea, conceptualized. So in all of this, where he could have played a more decisive role or been more effective in ensuring that there is a split in that Muslim political opinion, because mind you, the Hindu Mahasabha was the only party which till the very end, even when the specter of partition was almost a foregone conclusion, it was the Hindu Mahasabha which opposed partition. Till May 1947 or June 1947, just 2 months before what happened. So in all of this, where I've listed some of his failures as a leader, and it's very easy for us today, sitting in air-conditioned rooms with the luxury of retrospective vision, and as a historian, to say, oh, they could have done this or they could have done that. It's very difficult to be in that situation at that time when every day was a changing, fluid situation, and what positions they took. But yeah, to make that decision also of the analysis, that this was probably one place where he could have played a better role. So the idea was, when I shared all of that with Mr. Ranjit Savarkar, not once did he say, this is going to be detrimental to, his prestige or anything, because I think that's the liberalism that comes. You have differing viewpoints as long as it's within the boundaries of civility and also facts when it comes to historiography, then it's okay. I mean, this is the judgment one can make also of characters of the past.
Actually, I wanted to also, before I throw it open to everybody for questions, I wanted to ask you about, we have now seen that, I've read the first volume, of course I read in entirety. This book I only got yesterday. I wasn't able to read it in entirety. But in the first book, you've sort of worked considerably on looking at how this whole apology letter that people made so much of, and you considerably spent time talking about it and putting it in context with how, there were other such letters and what it was done, what circumstances it happened under. In this one, you've also looked at the chapter where it looks at how he ended up being, embroiled, as it were, in the Gandhi assassination case. How tough which one was tougher, approaching the first book or the second, or did you work on them contiguously? How did it work?
Yeah, I think so. There were so many landmines again, like your questions. I think both the books too proceeded through one landmine to the other. The revolutionary part of Savarkar was the easiest to portray because there were no rough edges there. But again, I don't consider them ever. I keep saying it both in Hindi and English that it is not a mercy petition. I think it is. It's just a petition, yachika, as you would call it in Hindi. That any political prisoner, it was not a special privilege given only to him that you can file a petition. All other political prisoners also filed it, right from Barin Ghosh to Sachindranath Sanyal to so many others, and they were all let off as per a general amnesty. And he himself was not, ashamed to talk about it in his autobiography, his memoirs of his days in the cellular jail, My Transportation for Life, Maji Janma Thep. He very, very clearly talks about, I wrote this kind of a petition. Even in the Echoes from Andaman, that book, to his younger brother, he is writing letters. And even there, he's talking about the petition. Gandhiji also filed a petition on his behalf, with the British government for both him and Babarao Savarkar. So it was not a big deal at that time. We've constructed that as a great offense that he was groveling for mercy and all of that today. But my simple, argument against that was if he had actually become a British stooge and if he had sold out to the British, he was taking this pension of 60 rupees, which actually several other, political prisoners were also getting that as part of the government scheme because they didn't have a source of income or livelihood. The British would have actually made use of him. The British took very good care of those who were on their side. I recently put out on social media this letter of this, a mole in the Revolutionary Party, a very famous Hindi writer, who many people also accuse of being the spy who gave out the secrets for Chandrasekhar Azad and eventually led to him being holed up by the police and he killed himself. Now, this writer was actually put in jail to prevent him from being killed by the revolutionary comrades. To save his life, the British put him in jail. They got him married to someone in jail, and he had a kid or something also in jail. So they took very good care of him. And after independence, there's that letter which Dharmendra Gaur, one of the IB chiefs, in his book he writes that while transferring power to in 1947, the British actually say he's been a very loyal fellow. He's done us a lot of good. So please take good care of him even after we have left and gone. So those who were on their side, the British took wonderful care of him, care of all those people. Whereas Savarkar was constantly under surveillance. The restrictions that were put on him for 5 years, every time it came up for a review, the British government would say his track record is dubious, he is not to be trusted and all of that. And from 5 years, it kept getting extended to 13 years. So if someone is on your side, why would you put surveillance on them? And he was a useful fellow, he was intelligent, he was a lawyer. So when government started forming in India after 1937, they would have co-opted him into the government. He would have become the chief minister of Bombay State or something like that if he were on their side. The British were not foolish not to make use of his intellect and his expertise. So all this clearly shows that they were deeply suspicious of him right till the end. And as I said, both Nehru's government as well as the British government were suspicious of him. And because on the one hand, he and the Mahasabha were dealing with the government and the viceroy, but behind their back, they were also dealing with the Axis powers who were inimical to the British government, whether it was Hitler or, Italy and Japan, through Rash Bihari Bose and the formation of the Indian National Army. So that's one reason the British government was never trusting of this man. And you brought out that's another big landmine, which is very tough for a biographer to talk about. Yeah, I think the mic also gives up when I talk about Gandhi assassination.
Your voice is being stifled.
Through Mr. Ranjit Savarkar and with the help of the National Archives of India, almost 11,000 pages of the murder trial papers, and the Kapoor Commission and all of that I went through. It was such a fixed case. It's evident to anybody, any person with a minuscule amount of legal, knowledge, that he was just made the fall guy. Now, of course, not to say that Nathuram Godse and Narayan Apte and others who actually carried out that heinous murder were not his acolytes earlier. They were a part of the Hindu Mahasabha, and they were also the part of the Hindu Rashtra Dal, the Boy Scouts that he had created within the Mahasabha. But in Godse's own dying declaration testimony, he says, after 1945, we got disillusioned with Savarkar because he was becoming very pacifist. He was taking a conciliatory stance towards the government, saying this is now government of Indians, so we cannot be opposed to it, and so we need to be conciliatory. And so we decided to break away from the old faction of the Mahasabha and chart our own path. He says this as a testimony in court. And then, this happened in 1949. The court actually exonerated him honorably. He was the only one among the 9 accused to be exonerated honorably, not as people say for lack of evidence, but because there was no evidence. It was just based on that one flimsy, confessors, the police approver, Digambar Badge, who said, we all went to Savarkar Sadan, and he told in Marathi, Yashasvi hoon, be successful and come back. And that there's no sir na pair of this thing as to anybody can say anything about anyone, and that doesn't become evidence against that person. And so that's why he was exonerated. But despite that, I bring out in the book that 1949 he gets the clean chit. But in the 1951 elections, the first general elections, Nehru uses this against him, against the RSS, which was not even linked to the murder. At least the Mahasabha, there was some association through Godse and Apte. But in the election speeches that Nehru does, he continues to, say these were the assassins of our father of the nation. And that continues till today in political rallies all the time. And as late as 2018, and we have Dr. Pankaj Phadnis, who's sitting here, who filed that public interest litigation in the Supreme Court, saying that the Supreme Court appointed an amicus curiae, and for 1.5 years, they perused all the documents, and on the basis of that, someone no lesser than the stature of Justice Bobde, the former CJI, and Justice Nageshwar Rao came out with this observation that the implication that Savarkar was involved in Gandhi's murder, it doesn't hold water at all. And the trial court's verdict actually holds. A commission of inquiry does not have the jurisdiction to override a trial court's verdict. And he's not even alive to defend his case when the Kapoor Commission was set up. So on the basis, so many times it's an Agni Pariksha that a person has to go through. So voluminous 11,000, 12,000 pages of documents that are there in the archives. People don't read all that, and it's like a broken gramophone record that goes on. And even after this, today if we tweet, the first thing, par wo to maafi veer the, par wo to Gandhi ke assassin the. So these are the only things that are going to keep being spoken about, because the narrative has got so fixed and nobody wants to read the truth and understand it.
So I think we are very glad that you've put in so much work to bring out all this history, and I'm sure people will get the book and go through it to find out what the real truth is. I must
add one little thing that also, it was a little surprise and a shock to me while in the course of the research, that not only Savarkar, who paid a price for Gandhi's murder, and we are in Mumbai, we are in Maharashtra, an episode from Maharashtra's history that has been completely whitewashed. The genocide of the Maharashtrian Brahmins that happened after the murder of Gandhi, that even today people in Maharashtra may not even know about that. When I was doing my research, I put out on social media saying, can people come out with their family stories of how openly, first it started with Chitpavan Brahmins and then the Deshastha Brahmins, who were, just because Godse and Apte were Maharashtrian Brahmins, and their caste was outed to the press within few hours of the murder. And by whom and for what reason, God alone knows. So that within a few hours, riots broke out in Mumbai, in Pune, and then went to Nagpur, Satara, the entire, Sangli, the Patwardhan princely states, where openly there was an ethnic cleansing, like what happened for the Kashmiri Pandits, where villages were cleansed of Maharashtrian Brahmins, and many of them lost their lives. The actual number would not even be known to people because FIRs were not filed. Instructions came from the top, apparently, to ensure that these stories should not be heard. So when I put this out on social media saying, are there family histories of your grandparents or whoever, who must have faced this, I was there was a deluge of information that came. Hundreds and hundreds of people who wrote to me with their personal stories. A few, someone in their 80s and 90s who was still alive, also gave me eyewitness accounts of how they were victims of this carnage that happened, where people, goons just came in truckloads and burnt houses, and women were molested, and children were killed, and people burnt alive. Someone in, I think it was Nagpur, where someone who just had the surname Godse, who was a poor school teacher in some village there, was actually his father, his elder brother, they were all tied to the cot and burnt alive. But these stories don't matter at all today. And many of these people, if you see in the appendix to the book for the first time, I've probably in print, at least in English. I think in Marathi there are a lot of novels around this episode, but not in a direct way again. It's a circuitous way it is spoken about. So in print, in English, to put those first person accounts, because history offers that space to heal. Rather than put things under the carpet and whitewash things. Many of them gave their testimonies to me, but they had a request that please keep us anonymous. We are still scared. After 70, 75 years, we are still scared to put our names out, because people who are, who led those mobs or who conducted this carnage are in very powerful positions in Maharashtra today too. So it's very, very difficult. So on the one hand, this is adding insult to injury, where you deny that, you talk to someone and say, "Aisa kuch hua hi nahi tha. I don't think this is just some right-wing propaganda," and so on like that. But to deny even the occurrence of a carnage like this, justice is far, cry from that. Even to deny that is adding, as I said, an insult to injury. And I think, as I said, history should offer that space to heal, to also pay those tributes to all those people who lost their life for no fault of theirs, and to move on and make peace with it.
Finally, I just wanted to ask you about, that was the question I was trying to ask about. We spoke of political apartheid and the idea of how a kind of narrative is completely denied any space and not allowed to come forth in any way. But at the same time, do we draw any line? Because now, the far right, or which was on the right, or which was on the fringes, is taking center stage all over the world. And whether it is in Europe, whether it is even countries like Germany, you see them coming back to power. And now people are putting out books which are sort of legitimizing that and coming out with narratives which are saying that, yes, we needed to kill so many Jews, we needed to put them into gas chambers, we needed to do this. People are putting out those kind of narratives as well. So what would you as a historian draw a line at when we go out and say that we want to have all kinds of narratives being given space to have their say? Do we draw a line somewhere and say that this much and no more? Do we draw a line, or then we say, no, now it's open, everybody can come and have their say? Yes, you also wanted to say something, Priyanka ji, on this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, look, the thing is, you said we should. Who is this we? Who is sitting there to certify what should be the narrative? Or who is a censor board who's going to decide this much, this far, and no further? I think it's the readers who will then decide if, I don't know of a book like that. But then what I would say is, even in Europe or in Germany, where Hitler is a reviled man, there are, every second year there's a biography written of him. Mein Kampf is openly sold. They don't cancel culture him, because history also offers those lessons to us.
Mein Kampf sells more copies in India than anywhere else.
Yeah. But then after in the 1960s, when the English biography of Savarkar was written by Dhananjay Keer, why is it that mainstream historians did not pick up someone who is so relevant to India today? And if we are also trying to understand Hindutva and why it came about, and someone who was the founder of the ideology, why is there no engagement with him in a scholastic manner? Why do academicians have this cancel culture? And I think this is not just a problem only in India. Worldwide, a conservative view is never given space, in academia, in media, in cultural bodies, where there is a hegemonistic hold of just my way or the highway. which is actually the illiberal. So when people actually hyphenate liberal left, I have a problem because I don't think the left is liberal. Right from the days of Marx to Mao to Stalin to Pol Pot to anybody, or our own dear comrades in few states, luckily that they are restricted to, the left is not liberal. So I don't know why we hyphenate and say left liberal. Especially in academics. As I said, I'm not a politician, but in academic circles and in a discipline like history where multiple narratives, there's no one absolute version. There are multiple narratives. It's different. It's that imagery I always draw of the blind man and the elephant. Each blind man touches different parts of the elephant and says, this is how the elephant looks like. They're all right, all correct, and they're all false also, because that's a limited scope that each blind person, depending on the amount of documents at their perusal, is able to configure the past. So it's a sum of parts of all their narratives. But to deny a particular narrative and to say this is the authentic version and there is no other version, I think that is detrimental to history and to historiography of India, and that's what we are suffering from. And each time we do that, each time we whitewash, each time we do not acknowledge excesses of the past, and that was what Savarkar did in his 6 golden epochs of Indian history, where all those invasions, all those atrocities that were done on religious grounds and on predatory invaders, that's all stated. So please, why do we have to put the onus of that on today's Muslims? They are not responsible for what Ghazni or Ghori or Aurangzeb and Tipu Sultan and all these people, bigots, did. So state that. Don't whitewash it with the false belief that stating that would actually disrupt social unity and national unity today. Why do you want to make these bigots icons for today's Indians? They should be, as an Indian Muslim young man or woman, should feel as repulsed about a Ghazni invasion as a Hindu or a Christian or anyone needs to. Let's not make icons of these barbarians just for appeasing a particular group. Let's talk about all of this. As I said, heal and move on. History is not to be something that you're stuck up with. You have to hear it, heal, and move on for a better future.
Yes, healing is important and is an important part of even evolution as a democracy. And healing becomes important when history is given in its right context. So I partially agree with what Vikram is saying. There were some parts of the book which I strongly disagreed about also, and that's my disagreement with some ideas. But however, what is important, which he said, some part of an entire story. We cannot be reading some of the parts and deciding and choosing that this is my part of the history and this is what I will live with and this is what I will keep defending and die defending. You have to understand a particular context in history which had, I would say, जैसे there's a saying, सबका खून है शामिल इस मिट्टी में. So you cannot deny मेरा खून, इनका खून, just like you cannot deny someone's part in creating that, being a part, an important part of that history-making process. So you may disagree, you may dissent, and India is not such a weak democracy that we cannot open up these floodgates for discussion, dissent, and debate. And only when we open the floodgates truly of all contexts and all versions of history will we be able to find our own central position. That is extremely important. There is no left-wing ideology in India, there is no right-wing. India's civilizational history shows. These are Western constructs which have been dumped upon us. We have taken the best of all worlds and we've created our own path. And that path, you will India, Indians, the young, the women, and all sections of society will find its own path when you have all context of history in place and the floodgates or dams that have been, those walls that have been protecting these stories or have been limiting these stories are opened for true dissent and true discussion and debate. That is my personal feeling. You agree?
Thank you, Priyanka ji. What we will do is now maybe open the floor to questions. It's been a long time since that the right-wing space has not had such an exceptionally articulate man who speaks so beautifully and writes so beautifully. The intellectuals intellectual space generally with the right. No, but which is why it will be great if, you know, opportunities open up for Mr. Vikram Sampath here. Anyway, so we'll take questions.
Thank you for this discussion. So I just wanted to say that I first came in contact with V. Savarkar. I saw a film on him in the late 90s. And it was revolutionary. I mean, you know, we study history, but we want Indian homemade heroes. And then there was Kalapani. So I think there should be more such films. And now you've written this book. You know, I mean, it's too fat for me to read, but if there's a film or something, I would love it, or a slimmer volume. But hats off to you for popularizing it. I don't know why this debate went into, you know, criticizing him. I mean, if you see how they lived during the British times in jails and all, they were all freedom fighters. So I'm confused by what discussions kind of was going on. I mean, he's a you know, freedom fighter. I don't understand that. Anyway, thank you, Vikram.
I wish everyone in the country actually thought like you. You just need to go on social media to see, as I said, even now, if we post make a post on this either on Twitter or wherever else, there'll be 100 people who say, "Arey, you're eulogizing an apologist, coward," and all kinds of. I don't want to. I mean, mare ko kya marna hai? He gets so much of flack all the time that. But then, you're very right. I mean, the sacrifices that not only he but his entire family did. That's something that itself is reason for people to venerate him. The 14 years in jail, 11 of them in cellular jail, the kind of sufferings. I mean, how many mainstream, other than being executed, of course, the ultimate sacrifice, being alive and suffering those kind of ignominies where basic human facilities of good food, toilet or medical facility is not given to you. All day you're doing that Kolhu ka bail punishment in the blazing heat of Port Blair. You're not being given pen and paper to write, and then with his nails he's carving on the walls of the jail 6,000 verses of those beautiful Marathi poetry, Kamala and Saptarshi and so many others. Just that bit is enough to make him a national icon. And as I said, the family, his wife Yamuna Bai, his elder brother Baba Rao, his sister-in-law Yeshu Vahini, his younger brother Narayan Rao, all of them, the kind of sacrifice they did, they could have easily become entered politics and made political capital of his name. Dr. Narayan Rao, I mentioned Savarkar and the Maharashtrian Brahmin genocide. Dr. Narayan Rao's, he was a medical doctor here in Mumbai, in Dadar, and his clinic was attacked by people. He was beaten up with stones. He lay in a pool of blood, and he never recovered from this. And he died of a brain hemorrhage, a couple of months later in 1949. So, and even when all the brothers were literally in jail, it was left to the women of the family, both Yeshu Vahini and Yamuna Bai, to literally beg for money to earn a livelihood. And it was Madam Bhikaji Kama, that great revolutionary, who was also sending money from France for the upkeep of the Savarkar family, because they were socially ostracized. Everything was taken away. His degrees were taken away from him. His graduation degree from Ferguson College, his law degree from London that he had striven to get. So on paper, he was just a metric pass. They came from a landlord family. Their properties were taken away by the government. Even the utensils in the house were auctioned away. And in jail, his copy of his Bhagavad Gita and spectacles too is taken away by the government. This was the kind of sacrifice that this man and his family gave for the nation. And we today in 240 characters sitting in comfort of our room say, it was not worth it at all. How ungrateful can we be as a nation?
No, I'll just like to add one thing. You commented on the discussion that included us also. So the only thing is, nobody is even debating his patriotism. None of us here, all of us. I mean, we are not talking about the limited context of three of us. There's a whole raging controversy, and that's why the book is called A Contested Legacy. We are discussing that. And when we have absolutely no disagreement about his patriotism and him being a national hero, which has been acknowledged, may not be acknowledged in recent times, but has been acknowledged by former prime ministers, whether it was those who were part of the independence movement. Whether it was Srimati Indira Gandhi or when he passed away, there were so many people who, cutting across political party lines, have said what they have said about him. But there is a huge discussion and debate about it, and you cannot deny that discussion also. So we were, I think, having a very free and frank discussion on that.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that, when I could start thinking, which was after school, is the holy cows were not so holy, and the unholy cows became more holy, because we were taught a certain narrative, and then when you could think for yourself, then you knew what was what, and especially when one got exposure and saw some more. Thank you.
Actually, you said that the book is quite thick, but we had a little word before this event could begin, and Vikram said that there is some talk of a biopic. Maybe we'll have to wait and see where that goes. Yeah, I have something.
Actually, I would like to share some of the experience of this Supreme Court case which Vikram just spoke about. The biggest criticism of Savarkarji has been his so-called involvement in assassination of Gandhiji. And Supreme Court has very clearly said the petitioner's submission that Shri Savarkar was held guilty of assassination of Gandhiji is misplaced. That's the highest court in the country which has put a final stamp that Savarkarji was not involved in murder of Gandhiji. Now, there are certain myths which are being propagated despite that. In fact, even during when this hearing was going on, and I'm not a lawyer, but I was arguing in person, I would like to, if I can take 2 minutes, I'd like to share those things, because unfortunately in our country, we don't have transcripts of the proceedings. Judges at times are provocative and deliberately so. They don't mean any malice, but they want to get the truth out of you. So at one point, Justice Bobde said, and he said in Marathi, that was quite surprising. He says, didn't he say Yashasvi Hon Ya? He asked me. So I said, that was a prosecution story, it was never proven. Then Mr. Sharan, who was appointed as the amicus curiae, is a senior advocate, he stood up and said, but Kapoor Commission passed those observations because Savarkarji paid him money. Then I had to point out that yes, Savarkarji did pay money to Godse for starting a paper, not for assassination of Gandhiji. Then he actually crossed his limits and said, which most people talk about who are against him. They said, Kapoor Commission passed those observations because Savarkarji's bodyguard and secretary came and deposed before the Kapoor Commission about certain things. I had to point out that this is false. First of all, the bodyguard and the secretary of Savarkarji never deposed before Kapoor Commission. There is a list of commission witnesses who were examined. These names don't figure. I had to point out that whatever Kapoor Commission is referring to is 20-year-old confessional statements recorded under duress, which were never produced in the court, never proven. So how could a so-called judge, and I use these words, how could a judicial mind take cognizance of 20-year-old confessional statements and make any observations? Mr. Sharan had no answer to this. And all this discussion ultimately led to this judgment that Kapoor Commission could not overrule the trial court, and Savarkarji was never held guilty of murder of Mahatma Gandhi. So I think this debate ought to end, but unfortunately it still goes on in insidious circles. This is where I object to, Vikram very rightly pointed out, who are these we to control the gates of debate? I think debate will have to be free and frank, whether somebody likes it or not. Thank you.
Sir, do you think that Gandhiji and Jawaharlal Nehru, they were afraid of intellect and philosophy of Savarkarji, and hence from initial days they were afraid to fight or counter the policies of Savarkarji, and hence they had a separate narrative that Savarkarji wouldn't get any good platform and he could become more famous than both of them. So even before independence and after independence, he was cornered with their Malafite thoughts.
I think there were two different people, Gandhiji and Nehru. We can't even club them. Their attitude towards Savarkar was very different, in my view. Of course, Gandhiji and Savarkarji were ideologically opposed to each other right from the very first meeting. I mentioned that in the first volume, whereas young men, they meet in London, in India House, where Savarkar is cooking prawns, and Gandhi goes to meet him and he offers this to eat, and he says, no, I'm a vegetarian and I'm not going to eat this, and he kind of makes a jibe at him saying, this is just boiled fish. We want young men who can go and eat the British alive, and what are you doing? You're not even eating fish, and if you can't eat with us, how will you fight with us? And a few years later, they meet during the Dashera celebration in London, where again, both of them share stage, and Gandhi speaks first, and he says, I don't want to talk about politics and all that. I will philosophize about Ram Rajya and its, the hallowed concept of what Ram Rajya means. And immediately after that, Savarkar goes to the podium and he says, we're talking about Ram Rajya. Even Ram had to kill Ravan to establish that Ram Rajya. He didn't go and conduct a satyagraha in front of Ravan and to get Sita out. So I think that fundamental difference in their approach to freedom, that was always there. And he said, we are celebrating this in Dashera, where on all the 9 days the Devi is worshipped with so many astras and shastra, which is not an ornamental thing. It is to annihilate evil. So if you consider the British Raj as evil, then picking up arms against it should not be something that is bad. And in the Hindu tradition, to destroy evil, picking up arms was something that was par for the course according to him. So this fundamental difference, and then differences on Shuddhi and untouchability, and this complete eradication of caste vis-a-vis Gandhi's idea that he still believed in the Varna system. He thought that it is not odious, and that Hindu society would actually break down if the Varna system is shaken. His disagreements on that even with Dr. Ambedkar, and the hallowed view of Hindu-Muslim unity, on which they always had differences, where this whole idea that if you had to strive for something, they always said Gandhiji strove for Hindu-Muslim unity. So if something was already existing, why do you have to strive for it? The very fact that someone had to work hard towards that showed that there were those dissensions which was not being acknowledged. So I think these were the fundamental differences between these two men. On no account they ever came on the same ground, and they meet in, as Priyanka ji mentioned, they meet in Ratnagiri too, where while departing, Gandhi says, I don't think we have meeting ground on anything, but will you allow me to do my experiments? To which he replies that, Mahatma ji, you can do your experiments, but those will be at the cost of the nation. And I don't know whether those were prophetic words which were proved right 2 decades later with partition and whatever happened. So I think Gandhiji and Savarkarji's, at least the opposition was more ideological. In the case of Nehru, as what I see it, more than ideology, it becomes a lot of personal animosity, I perhaps think so. Because there's this very telling incident where in 1957, to celebrate the 100 years of the 1857 uprising, which Savarkar called the first war of Indian independence, hitherto disparaged as Sepoy Mutiny. To celebrate the centenary, there's a group of people who want to do an event in Delhi and invite all the revolutionaries who are still alive and Savarkar, and they also go to the Prime Minister then and say, you should preside over the meeting. And Nehru actually, and quote the source where he says, I'm not comfortable sharing stage with him, and it will be an embarrassment for both of us because I don't even consider that book as history. It's a lot of flourish, which I don't believe in, and so on. But the organizing committee chose to drop the Prime Minister of India, but they actually invited Savarkar for the event. So, and the way the Preventive Detention Act was imposed on him and several others in the run-up to the first general elections of the country in 1951, all of that showed the constant, a lot of personal animus between the two men, which I don't know how much of it had an ideological base. Gandhi and Savarkar still had solid reasons to disagree with each other, but I don't think it was the same when it came to Nehru. It was rather flimsy differences that, and as I said, even after exoneration, to keep harping on him being the assassin and so on, which continues, as I said, in political rallies to this day, for which people making those claims also have to go later to court and actually say, I'm sorry, and apologize, a thing that they actually accuse Savarkar of doing. So I don't know if I answered your question in a very long-winded way, but it's just that I thought these were very two different. We say Gandhi and Nehru as if they are one unit. Gandhi and Nehru disagreed with a lot of what Gandhi did, including the Khilafat movement itself, the Gandhi-Irwin Pact, and Quit India movement. Many of it, there was a lot of dissent within the Congress. Of course, Gandhi finally ensured his view was accepted by everyone within the Congress.
Thank you.
I think we are done with questions.
Yeah.
Right.
I think so. I'm going to ask last question.
Absolutely, sir.
I have
please.
gone through Vikram, your interviews and all the criticism of the earlier book and this book also, and even today's discussion also. One thing I observed is a very important part of Savarkar's philosophy was totally avoided or not discussed. You were ready to discuss, but you were never asked the questions. And that is the concept of Hindutva. His definition of Hindutva, the people he considered, the set of people he considered Hindu, was the same set of people which was described as a Hindu by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in Hindu Code Bill. Your comments, why this important issue is even today, the opponents of Savarkar and followers of Savarkar, nobody talks about his concept of Hindutva and how rational and how...
Yeah, that's
When you're touching on that, please also talk about how, as as distant as he is from Gandhi, as close he is to Ambedkar.
Yeah.
So there are so many views in which Baba Saheb and Savarkar's views come.
Yeah, both of them, I think their views on a casteless society, as I said, was so opposed to what Gandhiji spoke of or thought of. Maybe he was a piecemeal reformist. He knew our society was very orthodox. It could not take so much of shake-up in one jhatka. So you have to, go slow. Whereas both these men were very nihilistic in their approach, saying eradicate caste as a whole. And time and again, Savarkar also invites Ambedkar, saying, come to Ratnagiri, see what I have done. This is a pilot project. In 13 years, we have ensured complete, castelessness, where people of all communities are sitting and eating together. People are, worshipping together. There's intercaste marriage. There's a temple where everyone can enter, irrespective of caste. Schools where all children can sit and study. And his restrictions were to Ratnagiri, but Ambedkar could scale that project up to the rest of India. So please do that. But curiously, Ambedkar never comes and shares stage with him in those 13 years, as long as he is in Ratnagiri. Again, the political, they would not want to put their political careers in stake by being seen sharing even stage with him. And so it was only later, after he comes out, that the two men actually meet and so on. But before that, in those 13 years, with some excuse or the other, he never came. But to Ranjitji's, point, not only I think, his definition of who a Hindu was, which was not on theological constructs of Hinduism, which he thought was a subset of this Hindutva. It was more of a cultural and a nationalistic identity marker, where in the context of that Khilafat movement, he had constructed this, that anybody who is, within this, the Indus and the seas, who considers this land as the land of their forefathers, Pitrubhu and also Punyabhu, a holy land, not on the basis of religion, but their allegiance, their devotion to this land, they would all be Hindus. And ideally, all these, the Indic faiths would fall under that rubric. But even those, I mean, he says, what do we do with people like Annie Besant and Sister Nivedita, for whom this was not their Pitrubhu? But he says they would also be culturally and nationally Hindus because they've probably done more for this country than some of the indigenous Hindus have. One of them had converted, the other was not. So they were still practicing their original faith. So it was not faith-based. And as he rightly said, the Hindu Code Bill defines the word Hindu that way. But not only that, Ranjitji, I think so many other things that Ambedkar said has not been brought out into the public space. Those who in today's context and definition probably call Savarkar as an Islamophobe and all that, they just need to also read what Dr. Ambedkar had to say on his thoughts of Islam, Muslims of that time. And that's a context. There was suspicion because the partition of the country, whether you like it or not, was on religious grounds. So these leaders were responding to that stimulus, that they had to give arguments on that basis. So Ambedkar saying that Islam is a closed corporation, it divides the whole world into, for and against, and an Indian Muslim can never be loyal to his nation, and this is a civilizational conflict. There are two different nations. That's what Dr. Ambedkar says in his writings of 1940 and 45, where there has to be complete barter of population. Savarkar was still saying, can we still live together under a secular law? But Ambedkar said, he called his argument as illogical and queer, saying, how can you actually have a major nation and minor nation and stay together? It is so stupid that there will be conflict and national sovereignty will be affected. So many aspects of Ambedkar. And today, ironically, Ambedkar is the poster boy for anti-CAA protests, whereas I think he would have been the first one to have been in support of a law like that which looks after the religious minorities who are persecuted in those countries. And in the context of also what is happening today in Afghanistan and so many other places. So I think this cherry picking of history and historical characters and making holy cows, as the other gentleman mentioned, where conveniently all these facts are brushed under the carpet and we choose that version of history which appeals to us politically today, and a lie, when it is repeated 100 times, it starts assuming the shape of truth. And that's what has, I think, happened with not only Savarkar, but Ambedkar and Gandhi and Nehru and so many other figures.
Thank you very much, Vikram, and thank you very much, Priyanka ji. Audiences, one more question, I believe.
Vikram, I have a question. I'm just going to bring you to the current situation.
Oh my God.
No, it's not political, because many of us, after reading the first book, came to know a lot of, important factors and we started, visualizing Veer Savarkarji. When we all knew that you were going to write the second part, were you under any pressure to, cover up or go soft or something like that? That is number one. Second part of the question is, despite Supreme Court exonerating him, why is this lie being peddled? You can choose to not to answer also.
No.
Thank you.
I will choose to answer it. No, there was no pressure, as I mentioned, either from his family or his supporters. I think the so-called, not the ultra, but at least a lot of the so-called right wing still is open to dissent and discussion, unlike the illiberal, left, where it's not as if we don't even engage. So there was no such pressure that I faced. Now, the second part, that when this narrative changed, as Priyanka ji also mentioned, even in 1960s, 70s, 80s, when the tallest leader of the Congress, if she was giving money to set up from her personal fund for a memorial, issuing a stamp in his honor, got a movie made by the films division, and called him someone who was cast in the mold of a classical revolutionary, and his contribution to the in the annals of Indian freedom against the British is a very unique chapter of our history and all of that. Why would she do that if she was such a strategic stateswoman, and then why would she actually eulogize a traitor, a British stooge, Gandhiji's assassin, all of that? as being a Congress leader, that's something we need to ponder about. She had no, I mean, Savarkar was not political capital then, he's not political capital now. So she had no reason or obliged to be so nice to him at all. So that showed that at that time, this was not the narrative, whether even till the 80s. And in my assessment, I trace it more to the 1990s, when probably the first, BJP government came to power. During Indira Gandhi's time, the right-wing parties, whether it was the BJP or the Shiv Sena, or then BJP was not even born, the Jan Sangh which was there, were not political threats to the Congress. So they could afford to be generous to them, to leaders and icons of this. But then when the first BJP government under Mr. Vajpayee came to power, and also when it was seen that Savarkar was getting the importance, his portrait in the Central Hall of Parliament being unveiled, a plaque in his honor at Kalapani by Mr. Ram Nayak, the then petrol minister, and which was taken away by Manishankar Iyer and so on. That set the alarm bells that, okay, this is a force that is now able or capable to unseat us from our position. And if you see, even a few years ago in the parliamentary debate, which was rather sad, that someone of the stature of Mr. Kharge, I think in answer to the Prime Minister, said, even your dogs did not participate in the freedom struggle. Now, what is that sort of a narrative? Where is there one freedom struggle? Is there one stream that strove for our country's freedom? What about so many known and anonymous heroes and heroines? So their dogs did not participate in the freedom struggle. So that use of such language, that we are the unitary, the sole legatees of freedom, and so we are the rightful heirs to the throne of India, and anybody else who comes there is a usurper, and so is almost cheating the nation by sitting there, and we will overthrow and come there because it's our natural right to be in that seat. I think that is the illiberalism which is antithetical to democracy, and which this narrative then gets reinforced with so many books and media and all of that, where all these epithets then get normalized, and nobody wants to investigate the truth.
But one thing I must just add here. One thing
knew you would.
No, nothing to do with today's politics and whatever.
Yeah.
I'm just talking about how Savarkarji would look at the current system of democracy, where here he's debating, dissenting, disagreeing. And today we have a system where there is nothing which is entertained under the name of Veer Savarkar is something which also disturbs me. Where his name is being used to propagate an idea that there was no dissent, disagreement, which can be promoted. But this is totally different. Your book actually also lays open a lot of, utility of a name being used to crush dissent and differing voices. And I think that is something which we should also be debating.
And credit where it is due, I think the Shiv Sena has always held him as an icon, and even talked about, I think, more vociferously than the BJP for things like the Bharat Ratna for him and so on.
And I think one very important aspect that you brought into this book, and which needs to be reiterated, was how RSS disassociated itself during the run-up to the independence years, where it disassociated itself with what he was doing. Maybe he was getting more stringent about his views. Maybe he was getting totally disagreeing with a lot of points. Lots in the Hindu Mahasabha also were disagreeing with him on the Quit India movement decision, which he tries to justify, which you have mentioned. But it also shows that even then, within the Hindu Mahasabha, he was willing to listen and explain to them his point of view. He was debating and engaging with them. But this entire concept of non-engagement, no debates, no dissent, and my way or the highway is doing total disrespect to what he used to be. I just wanted to mention that about this current government dispensation. Thank you.
So just as I think one side says, if you don't agree with me, you're anti-national, go to Pakistan, now maybe Afghanistan now, that is bad. Similarly, to say that if you are not in the freedom struggle, you are all traitors, you're not patriots, you've not sacrificed, that is as bad and as undemocratic as probably the other, jibe is.
Actually, finally, I just wanted to say that, irrespective of where our politics lie and how we see Savarkar, it is true that at least as far as every Maharashtrian home goes, you will notice that 15 ऑगस्ट म्हणजे आमच्या घरी जयस्तु ते वाजणार, आमच्या घरी सागरात प्राण तळमळला वाजणार. We will listen to those songs even before we go to a Sare Jahan Se Acha. This is not to say that Iqbal is lesser and this one is, I'm not saying like that. But culturally, he will always remain, even in homes where Savarkar is someone who is reviled, is not actually seen up as a hero. But even in those homes, they listen to those songs.
And
So
he will not be
that's
called Savarkar, he'll be Swatantravir Savarkar,
Oh,
not
absolutely.
that in Mumbai and Maharashtra.
Absolutely.
I agree with you, Mr. Pawar. I come from a Maharashtrian family as well. So, unfortunately, we don't have enough time for more questions. I think. Sure.
I don't have questions because they have been answered all in the books. I just have to congratulate Dr. Vikram Sampath for this terrific effort, and I think you deserve a big hand for that.
And one more wish, that he should not be painted as right or left or whatever, particularly right, because our Indian culture is above right and left. Thank you very much.
I'm actually sitting in the left of everyone here.
So thank you to all three of you for making this evening so interesting. And on behalf of the foundation, I'd like to thank Dr. Sampath, Mr. Pawar, Ms. Priyanka Chaturvedi ji, and eminent guests for gracing today's occasion. I would also like to thank our presenter, Shree Cement Limited, and our associate, Penguin Random House India, and media partner, Lokmat. A special thanks to our hospitality partner, ITC Grand Central, and in particular, Area General Manager, Mr. Atul Bhalla, and General Manager, ITC Grand Central, Mr. Balani. Thank you very much for your hospitality. And last but not the least, thank you to all our patrons who've made these sessions possible even in these difficult times. Stay well and stay safe, everyone. I would ask everyone to take a copy of the book and have it signed by Mr. Sampath, but one book per family, please. That's the only request we have. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. So I congratulate the Prabha Khaitan Foundation and the Ehsaas Mumbai for this event. I think it was a beautifully organized event, keeping all protocols in place. I must say that. It was a wonderful event to organize. Vikram Sampath is a fantastic writer and historian, and I will be very glad that this discussion was very, very informative and gave me the perspective which is not a framework and it is going to be quite a good night.
It really helps when the guidance is so eloquent. You can, I can only dream the way he must have been this kind of information that we got sitting here for the hours. And I've read his previous books too. Brilliant writer. Just hoping to uncover this one now.
Thank you.